Hey everyone, it's Jack, and today I want to talk about switching from Windows over to Linux. And so this is in response to a request from Trent Channel, who has asked, "It's so hard to switch to Linux. Please make a more detailed video on how to switch." Well, okay, so I'm going to give it my best shot here. First of all, switching to Linux is a different scenario for everybody because there's so many different variables involved that there's really no one right way to switch over. For some, it might be easy peasy. For others, it may not even be possible. It depends on your situation. For example, if you have a computer and it's all yours, you don't have any kind of software on there that's absolutely proprietary to Windows that you can't live without, then switching over to Linux is going to be an easier transition. Now, if you're somebody that's using, let's say, for example, Adobe products, Adobe Premiere or Photoshop, and you absolutely cannot switch over to an equivalent, then switching to Linux may either not be for you, or you may want to have Linux on a separate computer and then use the Windows as a secondary. You can also run Linux side by side with Windows. However, Windows and Linux doesn't play very nice together, so it's not really my first choice, not really the way I would go. However, that is another option. And then there's virtualization, which I'll get into a little bit later. What you want to do first of all is you want to kind of consider your situation. Are you somebody that can switch to Linux? So if you have certain apps that run only on Windows and is not available in Linux, like the Adobe products, then you may need to stay in Windows for that, unless you're willing to use alternatives. For example, Photoshop's alternative would be most popularly GIMP, or PhotoGIMP, which is GIMP laid out like Photoshop. We also have Inkscape, which is a pretty nice alternative to Illustrator. So, there are options. Premiere, an alternative to that might be Natron, which is a video compositor, free and open source, and available on Linux. And then also Blender, you could probably accomplish the same stuff in it. However, you got to realize that you can't just simply move over to an equivalent software that's open source without some kind of learning curve. So you would have to invest some time into getting there and learning the new software as well. And of course, Microsoft Office and Outlook. So if you're using Outlook as your primary mail client, Microsoft Office is not going to work on Linux because it's not made for Linux. So you would also have to use an equivalent Office suite on Linux as well. And one of the most popular ones is LibreOffice. WPS Office is another one, which is very much like Microsoft Office. However, there's my cat. However, now I forgot where I was. So for example, if you're an Outlook user and you must use Outlook and you cannot live without Outlook, then that might be another problem that you may not be able to overcome unless you're willing to use Outlook 365 and do it through the website. Because again, you cannot run Outlook inside Linux because Linux is a different operating system altogether. Just like a Macintosh is not a Windows machine and Mac programs can't run on a Windows machine. And the same thing is true for Linux. You can't run a Linux app on Windows and you can't run Windows apps on Linux. However, we do have a compatibility layer called Wine, which will allow you to run a lot of Windows apps, but not all of them. And Office is one of those that just isn't going to work well at all in Wine. So you just want to forget about Microsoft Office if you're switching over to Linux. And so those are very important things you want to consider, is what types of software that you're really dependent on. Also, is it your computer alone? Or are you sharing that computer with other people in your family? Or is it a work computer? Maybe they won't let you do it. Maybe you have proprietary software at work that only works on Windows. And so those are all things that are very important to consider, is what works on Linux and what doesn't, that you absolutely depend on. If you can check those boxes off and say, yes, I'm good with switching over and substituting Photoshop for GIMP and Microsoft Office for LibreOffice, and changing from Outlook to free and open source alternative like Thunderbird, for example. That is a mail client that somewhat resembles Outlook and is very close to it. Another thing to consider, I don't think you can actually import email from your Outlook into another email client like Thunderbird. So I don't think I would go that route either. In fact, just taking the Outlook data file and moving it off a machine sometimes can hose the file. So yes, you would have to come up with a creative way to get out of that one too. For example, if your Outlook is hosting email that's also available on webmail, then you could potentially just make the transition a lot easier, because your webmail, as long as all your emails on your webmail, it can come over. But if you have custom folders and all that made in Outlook, don't plan on those folders coming over. You would have to rebuild all those. So yes, Outlook can be a real mess if you want to bring it over. It can be done if you want to do a lot of manual work, but there's no automated way to just get all your Outlook stuff into something like Thunderbird or an alternative email client for Linux. At least not one that I know of. So here I'm out at the Windows 11 website, and so yeah, that's mainly just for background effect. However, Windows 11 might be one of the reasons you might want to be considering moving on over to Linux. Some of you probably remember back when Windows 7 was transitioning into Windows 10, and do you remember the free upgrade? Upgrade for free! And then you were nagged and everything. For some, it was a relatively pain-free experience. They just hit the yes, upgrade me, and they transitioned to Windows 11 and all was well. Others were not so lucky. There were hardware compatibilities, driver issues, all kinds of fun stuff. Some people were jaded because they were even forced into buying a new computer. That's always fun, just to satisfy. And then, of course, those who resisted upgrading were nagged for months. And after that, their stuff just stopped working one by one, slowly over time, until they were finally forced into buying a new computer that was compatible with Windows 10. Oh, what a joy that was, huh? Yeah. So yes, I can understand why a lot of people would be jaded. My brother was one of them, actually. Mike. He was jaded for those very same reasons, where he was like forced into an upgrade, and somehow he was forced into having to upgrade when he didn't want to, and that really made him mad, and that got him onto Linux. So anyway, what is the easiest way to get over to Linux? Well, here's my advice. What I would say is, if you're going to go over to Linux and you think you're ready to go to Linux, then the best way to do it is to just jump right in. Just do it. First of all, you're going to have to back up all your data. I mean, to me, this is a must do. You really need to get a thumb drive or an external hard drive or something and put all your really important data on it. Actually, you should be doing that anyway, but because a hard drive will fail eventually and you will lose your stuff if you don't have a backup. It's not if, it's when. So anyway, if you're not already doing a backup, that's the first thing you want to do, is back up all the stuff that's important to you. All your tax documents, your pictures, any documents that you might have, videos, and everything that is important to you on the computer. You need to get those backed up onto something first. Once you got that out of the way, then it's time to pick out a Linux distro. And coming over from Windows, if you're really comfortable with the whole Windows layout, where you have the taskbar on the bottom and the menu on the lower left side of the screen and so forth, a very traditional look, then I would recommend going with either Linux Mint, which we have here, or Ubuntu Cinnamon. And the reason I'm recommending those is because, first of all, they're based on a very stable Debian, and Cinnamon is very Windows-like. If you're coming over from Windows and getting into Linux for the first time, Cinnamon has a desktop experience that you will feel right at home with. So why am I recommending two different flavors? Why Mint or Ubuntu Cinnamon? That's because Linux Mint is pretty lightweight, So it doesn't use a lot of resources. It's based on an older kernel, and the software is older version software, but it is stable. So if you have an older machine, something maybe you were running Windows 7 on originally and had to upgrade to Windows 10 and then it got kind of slow, well, if you put Linux Mint on it, it's going to be super fast again. It's going to be blazing. You'll be amazed. Now here at the Ubuntu site, this is a fairly new distro, the Cinnamon version, that is. Ubuntu isn't new, that's been around forever. But anyways, Ubuntu has a Cinnamon Remix, which is currently community version. I don't think it's been officially adopted into the Ubuntu family, I guess, for lack of a better word, yet. However, it is in the Ubuntu community, and it is a community spin, and it is really excellent. Ubuntu Cinnamon uses a newer kernel, nearly the latest one, I believe. It's like 5.13 if I remember right. And also, you can run a little bit more cutting-edge software on it, and it's got the Snap Store as well. So almost the same experience, really. You got the Cinnamon desktops. You're going to still have the same Windows-like experience, but on just a little bit newer kernel. And so if you're running newer hardware especially, you're less likely to probably have any kind of compatibility issues. Those are things to consider. And of course, the beauty of Linux is if one doesn't work, you can just switch over to the other. First of all, you got to know how to get Linux onto something that you can install it with. And of course, you'd want to have a thumb drive to do that. So what you want to do is you want to take a thumb drive, and first of all, we're going to download an image. So for example, here out at the Ubuntu website, what I would do is simply go to the download section. And of course, this is going to work with Linux Mint too, the same procedure. So you just go and hit download here. It's going to take us out here to SourceForge. And then here it's going to ask us for our download. So you would simply go ahead and save your file and hit OK. And then save it to your download location that you normally would save to. And then once that's downloaded, of course, you need a way to burn a bootable image onto your stick. So in Windows, what I would recommend is there's two primary softwares that I think would do the trick. The first one is called Etcher. And Etcher is out at Balena.io. Balena Etcher is really an excellent burner. All you would have to do is download the software, and then once you install and open the software, we have this. And so we have a window here, and easy peasy. All you have to do from here is just select Flash from File, and then select the ISO file that you downloaded. In my case, it would be here in the Downloads folder, Ubuntu Cinnamon Beta ISO. Select that and hit open. And then with your thumb drive plugged in, we're going to select our target. So just hit Select Target, and it'll automatically detect your drive typically. So all you got to do is just go ahead and hit Select, and the last stage is hit Flash. Once you hit Flash, the software will do its magic, and then you're the proud owner of Linux operating system on a stick, and it will be bootable. Now another alternative is Rufus. If for some reason you had issues with Etcher, which I'm 99% positive you won't when it comes to Ubuntu, but if you were using some other spin of Linux that you wanted to use and the image didn't burn correctly for that distro, then Rufus is another alternative, and you can use Rufus instead and burn it. Rufus will usually come through if you have some kind of a funky configuration on a different distro that doesn't work with Etcher. So Rufus is another alternative. So if you have problems in Etcher for any reason, Rufus would be the way to go. Personally, I use Etcher all the time, but Rufus, I believe, is a Windows only. Yeah, this is something that will work just fine. So this is the other one I would recommend, and it works pretty much the same way. Now, you also got to make sure that your computer is set up to boot to a thumb drive. So if you've never booted from a thumb drive before, then you'll have to go into your BIOS. First of all, I would just try booting your thumb drive. And then, so when you go into your BIOS, what you want to do is go into the boot settings. And in the boot settings, there's a setting in there called boot order. And typically that's where you would find your thumb drive. And have your thumb drive plugged in as well when you go into the BIOS, just because some BIOSes may need to see that thumb drive. Others, not so much. Depends again on the BIOS. But boot order is typically where you're going to find that. It'll either show your thumb drive in there, or it'll just be referred to as an external USB boot device or a USB drive. So those are things you want to kind of look out for. Now if you get in there and you still have problems, maybe it boots but it won't boot into the Linux Live image, then there may be a problem with a secure boot. And with a lot of distros, you got to turn off secure boot. So while you're in the BIOS, there's an option called secure boot, and it's usually enabled or disabled. Typically, if you want to disable it, you just use your arrow keys, arrow down to it, and then select items and then press enter, and it'll give you a drop down. Again, BIOSes are different, however, not hard to figure out. So just disable secure boot, and that should kind of do the trick for that. So that's another scenario that you might want to look for. Again, I think Ubuntu is okay with that setting, but otherwise I would turn that off. So that should cover the BIOS part. From there, all you got to do is arrow back over to exit and then save and exit. And then from there, it should boot to your thumb drive. If not, just power off the computer altogether, power it back on, and then it should boot to your thumb drive. So once you get past that, a lot of computers are already set up to boot to thumb drives. However, if yours is not, that's pretty much what you got to do. So from here, I am going to jump in and you can follow along as we boot to our thumb drive. So here we are at our grub screen. So when you boot your thumb drive, this is what you should see. And if you downloaded Linux Mint, then you'll see something similar. Here, this is what they call a live image. And so when we boot into Ubuntu Cinnamon, it's going to give us a choice of either just running the installer right from the console, or going into the live version and you can install it from there. Now the advantage of going into the live version is you get to go in there and you can actually experience the Linux distro without hosing anything. So you can go in there and try things out, and if you really screw something up, all you got to do is reboot and everything's fresh again. So it's kind of a hose-proof Linux. In fact, before you do your conversion from Windows to Linux, I would recommend just booting into this disk and checking things out first and seeing if for sure Linux is right for you, because there's a lot of things you can do right inside the live version. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. First of all, we're going to come up to a menu here with some choices, whether we want to go into the live version or the installer. Now, depending on your computer, it could take a few minutes to get to this menu. So if you're seeing nothing but a black screen or a cursor like this for a while, maybe a couple of minutes, don't let that alarm you. That's just all the stuff loading into your computer. And depending on the speed of your computer, it could be very quick or, like I said, a few minutes. I think this is about to come up. Here's where we get our choice whether to try Ubuntu or install it. And so typically, you probably want to go with try first so we can see the live environment. If you just want to get right down to it, you can go ahead and install Ubuntu right from here. The installer really is essentially the same, whether you're in the live environment or from here. I'm going to go ahead and hit try so you can see the live environment real quick. Okay, here we are in the live environment, so we're all booted in. And so you don't have to log in the live version, it just goes directly to the desktop. And here we have our Ubuntu Cinnamon installer. And as you can see, this is very familiar to you as far as the layout goes as a Windows user. And here we have Firefox, we have access to the terminal, and then our file browser, which should also look very familiar. And by default, this is using a dark theme. So we got the dark theme here with the dark background and the gray. So that's really nice looking. And then our menu over here. So again, as a Windows user, you should be very comfortable with a menu like this. Like I was saying, just go ahead and explore, look around and play with Linux. You can kind of see some of the alternatives, but we'll explore all that after we do the install. However, you can see an Office suite is installed on here, and then our internet apps. So I'm going to go ahead and run the installer. So let's go ahead and jump up here, install this onto the machine. Okay, so when we open the installer, here we have our welcome screen. English is the default, and I believe it's detecting our region, so we're good there. So I'm going to go ahead and hit continue. And then again, by default, it's showing our keyboard layout, which is all good. That's all English US. And now here it's asking what kind of apps we would like to install to start with. By default, we have our normal installation, and then minimal is probably for more advanced users that really want to put on all their own stuff. But I would definitely go with the normal installation for most people. And I would leave this checked as well, download updates when installing Ubuntu. I would also recommend checking this box. It's not checked by default. This is install third-party software for graphics and Wi-Fi hardware and additional media formats. And this is going to include some proprietary drivers also. That's something you want to have for maximum hardware compatibility. Make sure that you have the drivers that are going to work for your video card or your Wi-Fi. Without checking that, you could possibly have problems getting some of your things working, like the Wi-Fi, for example. That's kind of a big one. Or you might have some NVIDIA video cards, and your video card is another important thing. NVIDIA video cards can be problematic on some Linux distributions if you don't have the correct drivers set up and so forth. And also, if you're a gamer, that's another thing you want to consider. I didn't mention that earlier. Linux has got great compatibility with games. It's got Steam, Lutris, so ton of games you can play on Linux, but not everything. There are some games that aren't going to work on Linux, and that's one thing. If you're a hardcore gamer, you might want to reconsider or at least keep a Windows machine on the side that you can game on. So yeah, that's another thing. Gaming is pretty darn good, pretty impressive, and pretty fast, but not every game will work, because when games are developed, they're really developed for Windows computers in mind. If you're gaming only and that's all you want to do, then Linux might not be your best option. Let's hit continue. So now it's going to go ahead and prepare the drivers, and then it should go over to the next step here. And our default choice is to just erase the disk and install Ubuntu, assuming you backed up all your data. That is the choice that I would go with, is that. However, if you're a little more advanced, then you could go ahead and select the advanced features, or down here you can go with something else, which would be to create or resize the partition yourself. So again, if you're more of an advanced user, more technically inclined, and you want to set up your hard drive and you know what you're doing. But for the typical, I'm coming over from Windows, but I don't really know anything about Linux person, I would just stay with erase the whole thing and just install Ubuntu. And if you were to hit something else, then of course this is where you would kind of do it yourself. I would just go with the default here and hit install now. We'll go ahead and hit continue and let it do its magic. It's really pretty automated. Now I think if you are on a Windows computer, that stage there will also detect if you have a Windows OS on there, and it'll give you an option to install it side by Windows. And if you want to give that a try and just partition off part of your drive to reserve for Ubuntu, you can do that. However, you got to make sure your secure boot was not turned off in the BIOS, because if you turn that off, then Windows isn't going to work. So you need secure boot for Windows. Ubuntu is one of the few distros that I know of that make it easy for you to install Windows side by side. But as a general rule, they don't play well together. Now when I first converted over to Ubuntu, I did do the side by side install, and it was okay. I had to kind of tweak it a little bit. I had to get in there and kind of set up a different boot manager that would work for Windows, and so it was a little bit of extra work, but I'm kind of an IT inclined guy anyway, so you know, I got over it. But for some people that might be a little tough. Now I think Ubuntu might automate that process now, so it may not be as big a deal. However, I think you're probably going to be better off just having a separate computer or a laptop if you're not really ready to fully convert over from Windows yet. Otherwise, just play around in the live environment for a while. Just spend a week or two just going in the live environment and playing around, exploring, getting to know it. Get to know the terminal and so forth. I'm going to go ahead and hit continue. Here's where we'll set up our user information. I'm just going to go with Toadwick. You can make it anything you want for a user's name. The computer's name is generated automatically. However, if you want to change it, you can go in here and just make it whatever you want. And then our username, and then put in a password. And my password is weak. Weak password. How did they know my password? That's exactly what it was. Weak password. They exposed it. Those guys. Okay, and so you can also set this to log in automatically, so you don't have to log in. But if you want the login screen, then I would just leave it here at the default. And this is another nice feature, use Active Directory. So Ubuntu already makes it easy for you to connect to a Windows network. So if you're on a Windows network, maybe you're doing this at work, and they don't have any problem with you putting a Linux OS, and you're using their network, and maybe they're using Active Directory on the network. If that's the case, go ahead and check that box. And then that will make it easy for you to go ahead and use the Active Directory. And if you have any shared folders and so forth on an Active Directory network, you'll have access through them right from Linux. How cool is that? So yes, that's an option you could go with if you have Active Directory, and you would simply enter in the domain name in the Active Directory in the next step if you check that box. So you'd want to know what domain you're on if you're in Active Directory, which you would see every time you log in anyways on a Windows computer. So I'm going to go ahead and hit continue here. For most home users though, it's highly unlikely you're going to be in Active Directory unless you have a server set up. And if you have a server set up, then you probably don't need much advice on how to get into Linux. So after continue, this is going to begin the installation process. And so our install window's coming up now. And so now the install process is beginning. So here we have our Ubuntu stuff here, and it'll be scrolling through and telling you about different features that you'll get. And of course, the Linux Mint experience is very similar on the install. It's very simple, straightforward. All you really got to do is just follow the menus. So I'm going to go ahead and let this install. This should take maybe 5 minutes or so to install. And once it's complete, I'll be right back and we'll restart. Okay, so now we're inside the desktop. As you can see, the desktop looks just like the live image on the outside. However, now we're in the actual install. So let's go ahead and take a quick look around. You'll see a couple things that are probably kind of familiar. You got the computer up here icon. And so when we click on that, of course, it's going to open up our file manager, and it'll show you any mounted devices here. And then we got our home folder. This is where all our main folders are located, our documents, downloads, music, pictures, public, templates, videos, and desktop. So this will probably all look pretty familiar to a Windows user coming over. And again, I would strongly advise using the live version for a while first. Just remember that in the live version, nothing's going to be saved. So if you create a document and save it in the live version, it's going to be gone the next time you boot. It's always a fresh start when you reboot. So that's something you want to keep in mind. But the live version is really a good, safe way to just kind of get to know things a little bit first before you make the commitment. But with that said, I don't know if you ever use the terminal or the console in Windows, but things are definitely different in Linux than they would be in Windows. So if you're familiar with any of the DOS commands like dir, it'll work in Linux as well. It never used to, but it will now. But the other way to type that would be ls. And then ls is actually the official way to list your folders and files. So a lot of things I like to do personally in the terminal, and even when it comes to installing software. That's another difference between Windows and Linux. Is in Windows you got to open up your web browser, go out to the website, find the software that you're interested in and download it, and then run the installer and install it. Linux works a little different. In Linux they have what are called package managers, and so I can just jump in here and do a shortcut and just type it here in the search window, software, and it'll show up right here in the menu. We have one labeled software and one labeled Snap Store. They're essentially the same thing, but if we hit, like, say, software, we open this up, then this is going to look like an app store. So if you use an iPad or on your phone, you have an app store, and this is really the same kind of concept. So in here you got all these featured products here, editors picks and so forth of different software that you can install. And of course at the bottom here you got all these categories. You got your audio, video, games, developer tools, communication, graphics, education, productivity, add-ins, and utilities, all here in your selector here. So this is really nice, and it makes it a lot easier if you're looking for something specific. For example, if you wanted to jump in here and maybe find something related to audio and video, just hit that, then you'll get a bunch of apps that'll show up here eventually. Of course, being that this is the first time it's run, it's going to be downloading all the different thumbnails and so forth for the first time. And then of course those will be cached from there, and the next time you open it, they'll show right up. So these are a lot of things that you can choose from. And of course, if there's something specific you're looking for, then all you got to do is just jump up here into the search window. So let me just back up real quick out of that category and just hit the search icon up here in the upper left corner. And then you can type in the name of the app you might be looking for. So if you were looking for something that wasn't already installed on here, like let's say Inkscape, the old standby, the one I always do a search for. And Inkscape is kind of equivalent to the Adobe Illustrator. It's a vector graphics editor. So if you hit that, then of course it'll give you the description here and the install. And then by default, it's going to download it from the Ubuntu Snap Store. So that's going to be the latest version of this app, which as of the time of this video is 1.1, and then all that stuff. Last updated on May 25th of this year. Nice. And then we even have reviews down here, so you can kind of get a little idea of what other people are thinking. Very nice. I love their app store. It's really a nice setup, and unlike Windows, it's actually good. And then of course they have another thing in here called Synaptics. So if we just jump into administration, this is where our software package managers are. So Snap Store and then Synaptic Package Manager. Synaptics is kind of like the software package manager, the App Store visual one, except this is more like a front end to the terminal. So it doesn't have all the graphics in there. It's actually a bit faster because it doesn't have to load in all the different graphics and stuff. It may not give you as much info as far as looking at reviews and all that stuff, but really nice that you have all these different categories here to choose from. To search, all you gotta do is run over here to the upper right corner here and hit search, and you can do a package search in here and it will find it for you. And the other nice thing is that you do get a pretty detailed description here, just minus the graphics, so that way everything is really much quicker. It's, yeah, like I said, just kind of a GUI front end to using the terminal, which would be apt install. And so yes, you can actually install software right here from this terminal. So if I wanted to install something else like Inkscape, again, for lack of a better thing that I can think of off the top of my head, you would just type in sudo. Sudo means that you are going in as a sudo root user, except sudo spelled different. But it's kind of pronounced the same way. Some people prefer sudo. Semantics, I think either one is. I kind of relate to it more like sudo, like pseudo, a sudo root person, but you got root privileges. And then apt install is the command, and then you just put in the name of the application that you want to install, such as Inkscape. And then hit enter, type in your password, and your password is not going to show up when you type it, so it'll remain blank there. And then you hit enter, and it says that it can't lock in because I already got the package manager open here. I forgot to close it. There we go. So now that we close it, it's going ahead and telling us what's available here. And so it's going to offer to install this again because it's pulling a copy, I believe, from the actual repositories, whereas the other one I downloaded from the Snap Store. So if I said yes to this, I'd actually have 2 copies of the same app on here. So I'm just going to say no. Now, if I would have installed that through the repositories or installed this previously on the terminal, then Inkscape would still allow me to reinstall it, but it would let me know that it was already installed. And so it would pretty much just go back to the prompt. So that's how easy it is to install. And of course, you can also hit the up arrow button and bring it back to the previous entry that you put in here. And let's say I wasn't sure if Inkscape was actually an application that existed, so I could go over here and backspace over install and substitute it for search, and it'll look for everything that has Inkscape in it and let me know if that is anywhere around. I'm back to a blank terminal. What I did there, I think I just missed that part, but I just type in clear, and that'll clear the terminal and give you a nice clean screen again. And so the terminal might be kind of intimidating for new Linux users. It's really a good idea to kind of know the terminal a little bit, although you don't really need it like you used to. Back in the day, Linux was kind of known for just being the OS for geeks. And part of that is true in the sense that if you want to use Linux, you want to switch over from Windows to Linux, it is a transition. And again, Linux is definitely not Windows, but it's Windows-like in its look in a desktop like Cinnamon. And so when we're in Cinnamon, things look very familiar. It's very easy to navigate. It's easy to install applications and to find things. So here we have Office, and we have our Office suite, like Calc, which is equivalent to Excel. And we got Writer, equivalent to Microsoft Word. And so all these are compatible with the Office program. So you can load an Excel document in here and run it, or you can save it as an Excel document and then email it and share it with other people. So you're not going to be left out in the cold by using LibreOffice. I could create a document in here and then save it as a docx file and then send it to somebody else through an email, and they can open it up in Microsoft Office and it'll work just fine. There's really great compatibility. Now, if you're really heavy into Excel and you're using advanced formulas, there may be some formulas that don't match one-to-one between Office and LibreOffice, so that might be something that you want to consider. WPS Office is another Office suite which is free on Linux. And WPS Office, I think, is even more accurate as far as how the formulas convert over on Excel. And in fact, in my experience, I've noticed that WPS Office is much faster than Microsoft Office when it comes to large spreadsheets and so forth. So yeah, my personal experience anyway. So that's the package manager. And the equivalent to the control panel in Windows would be here. I just went up to the menu and hit this icon. It's also available under Preferences and scroll down, System Settings. This will also open the window that way. So once you're in the System Settings, this is kind of like equivalent to your Windows control panel. And so here we have our appearance, so you can change your background here. And also you can right click on your desktop and just select Change Desktop Background. And you can also get there from there. And then of course we got all these different categories here where we can select different backgrounds. So if you want to have a little change from your default, I just selected backgrounds, but there's a lot of different folders in here. And actually the backgrounds one looked pretty good. I think I'm just going to select that one. And here we got this really cool forest scene. That's cool. I'm going to hit our desktop icon so we can show the desktop. Now on Windows, this desktop icon normally sits over here in the end. if you use that a lot, you might be inclined to scroll over to the left lower corner to hit that show desktop, but it's not there. It's actually on the other side and it sits right here. So that's where you hit that. If that's something hard for you to deal with, one thing you can do is move that over. And to do that, all we got to do is edit our taskbar and we can slide that over. So if I right click on our taskbar here at the bottom, or our panel, we can hit panel settings. Actually, let's go to panel edit mode. I'm going to click that. And once we switch that over to edit mode, then this panel is editable. So I can grab this and I can just slide it right down to the end like this. And there it is. Now I can simply show desktop down here on the end, and it's in a place that's familiar and comfortable. So if that's something that kind of bugs you, it's that easy to move it. And of course you can move any of these icons around as well. And then when you're done, simply right click on the taskbar again and then turn that off, and then edit mode is off. And as you can see, when it's in edit mode, it has a little green bar here to kind of denote that you're in edit mode. And also, if you go into your panel settings, here you can customize all the different things. By default, our panel height is 40 pixels, which I think is pretty good, but if you want it smaller, you can just back it off a bit. And then you can see the taskbar on the bottom is shrinking. Or if you want it bigger, you can make it huge. It's all up to you. So lots of options here. One thing about Linux is that it's highly configurable. Windows is a fixed system. They don't really give you much to work with. It's locked down, and you can change the background and font sizes and the location of your taskbar and so forth. But that's about it. I think that's pretty much the extent of it. You can't customize the look in Windows the way you can in Linux. So Linux is so versatile, I could make this look like a Mac. I could make it look like Windows 11. The possibilities are nearly endless. There's tons of themes, and I got a lot of videos showing you how to pimp out Linux and desktops and so forth. So if you want to get into modifying your desktops, just look up some of my videos on pimping out the desktop, and you'll be amazed at all the stuff you can do. And so some of the basic things you can do right off the bat is, here you got your panel appearance, and you can tweak it for the left zone, center zone, and right zone. So you can even get down into your zones as far as the level of customization. And we also have our software updater, and it's showing us that there are some updates that have been issued. So I'm going to go ahead and let that install and do its update. And one thing I like about the updater is unlike Windows, it's very non-intrusive. I'm just going to type my password here. The updater is not going to lock you out of your machine for the whole morning if you have a major update. Back in my Windows days, that was one of the things that bothered me the most about Windows, is the update process. And I do remember times where I was literally locked out of my machine for 3 or 4 hours because of a huge major update that was running. And in one instance, my computer stopped working after that update. And I had a lot of stuff I had to get done. So I wasn't overly happy about that. And I didn't have a choice on that update. A lot of IT guys will say, well, you could have set up your settings to automatically run into that update so you could have more control over it. And though that's a valid point, that's not something that a lot of people would be privy to. And so your average user would not have that luxury to be able to go in there and and even know that it existed. It's something that I think is not one of their best features. It kind of goes along with that philosophy that they know what's best for you. And so they're going to make those decisions for you, whether you'll like it or not. But with that said, in all fairness, even though Windows is a proprietary closed source operating system, so you don't really know what's going on under the hood, and you don't have any real choices on how things work, for a lot of people, it's a necessary operating system. There are scenarios where they depend on software that they have to use for whatever reason, maybe work reasons or so forth, and that software may only have a Windows version and may not work under Linux. Now, I've used a lot of Windows software that does work just fine under Linux using what they call the Wine layer. And so Wine is a compatibility layer. It's not an emulator, but it's a compatibility layer for Linux. And with the Wine system installed, you can run a lot of Windows applications, exe files. Typically, you cannot run an exe file. Linux does not use exe for their executable files. So Linux will have a file name and it's executable, but it doesn't have a dot extension on it designating an executable file. So the Wine layer is, I don't think that's something installed by default. So if I type in Wine here, it's probably going to tell me that it doesn't know what I'm talking about, but it will tell me that I can install it. And here it shows me how to install it. So this is a nice thing I like in Ubuntu, is the apt service will give you suggestions on something if it knows that it exists. So here we got Wine, and then this is the development version of Wine, which is 5.22. And then if you want a newer version of Wine, if you want to get a little more advanced, you can actually go out to the website and Google install Wine 6 on Ubuntu, and then it'll give you the steps to installing Wine 6. And Wine 6 is a newer version of Wine, and personally that's what I would want to use because it's more compatible with more Windows apps. So if you're going to get into that aspect of it because you want to try to run some Windows applications, then I would recommend maybe giving that a shot. Otherwise, start out with Wine 5, and if you're going to do a Wine install, if you want to go that route, you can simply copy from the terminal, paste here, a sudo apt install Wine, and then I would even add another thing on the end of that, Wine Tricks. Wine Tricks is a companion application to Wine that makes it easier to kind of configure things in there. And of course, that's kind of beyond the scope of this little video here, but Wine is something that's really definitely worth Googling if you want to kind of play with different Windows apps. Personally, I just prefer using the Linux alternatives to those Windows apps because they're much better overall. They're open source. Typically, you just get a better experience. And after a while, you're going to find out in time you don't really need any of those Windows apps. I thought I did in the beginning, and so I kind of took it slowly when I transitioned over to Linux. And there was a lot of times I ended up going back into my Windows computer to use something, but in time I realized I don't have to use those apps. There's open source equivalents. And yes, there was a little bit of learning curve in some of the stuff that I was using. GIMP was a big one for me. For some reason, I kind of had a hard time adjusting from Photoshop to GIMP. But once I understood GIMP, I actually started liking it better. And to me, it was just a nicer experience, and things were actually a little easier for me. Whereas in the beginning, it was the other way around. It was more confusing. So yeah, go figure. It looks like our updater didn't take. So I'm going to click that settings button. So yeah, not really sure why that didn't take. Suppose I could just run that again. And I'm going to hit remind me later. Actually, it says the update's already been downloaded. So I'm just going to go ahead and try that again, just to see if it takes. Now in Linux, when you get something like that, if for some reason you do get an issue when you're trying to update, like through a GUI installer like that, you can also do the update through the terminal. And inside the terminal, it'll tell you exactly what's going on for the update. So sometimes that's a good alternative. So when you get this message, you could just OK out of it and then go in here and type in sudo apt update. And then it'll run through the update, and if there's issues, it'll tell me. If not, then we can go ahead and go to the next step, which is sudo apt upgrade. And when we run upgrade here, hit yes. Then it'll start its update, and then here it tells us what the issue is. So here it's telling us that there's no such file or directory for this application here. Multimedia, PNG, blah, blah, blah. So it seems to be having some kind of issue with this Yarrow cinnamon theme icon. So how I would solve this, and this is something that's kind of rare. You usually don't have update issues, especially with Ubuntu. However, I'm kind of glad it happened because you can kind of see a little bit of troubleshooting in action. So I'm thinking we could probably uninstall this theme, and then that way the updater will just install it from scratch, or we could just manually install it. So if I went in here and I said sudo apt auto remove, you can also just use remove, but I like auto remove because it'll remove all the different unneeded dependencies and so forth. And then we'll just paste in that theme thingy, Cinnamon theme icon. I'm not sure if that's the actual name, but let's hit enter. Yes, there it is. Okay, so we'll say yes to let it auto remove. And so that theme is out of there. So now we should be able to update, no problem. So now if we run our update, even if we do it through the GUI, it should work. But I'm going to go ahead and just repeat here. I'm just going to do the sudo auto apt upgrade. And it should run through. Okay, it looks like it already did everything. So apparently the only thing that needed updated was that actual theme. So if I go ahead and reinstall it, it should install a newer version. Okay, so the original theme was 21.4.3 and it was trying to install 21.10.1. So now that I removed 21.4.3, it should install the newest. So if I just hit my up arrow key, save myself a little typing, and here we got our sudo apt auto remove Cinnamon theme icon. If I go back here and change auto remove, just hit delete and change that to install, it should install the latest version of that. And there you can see it's 21.10.1. So now the latest version of that is installed, and that solved any update problems. So easy peasy. Not so easy if you don't know that though. But like I said, that's a very rare thing. So typically you never see any issues really with updates. But like I said, I'm glad that happened because that can give you a little bit of insight onto fixing a problem like that. Otherwise, all you got to do is simply Google that same error message. Just copy and paste that into Google. You'll get a result almost guaranteed from the community. Otherwise, you can jump into the community and ask some questions if you were really stuck and couldn't find anything. Personally, with me, I don't think that's ever happened. I've always found an answer just by copying and pasting into Google, and yeah, I was good. So yeah, just a quick tour here. Here we have our accessories folder, something you'd be familiar in Windows. You got games, and these are just kind of some basic games like Mahjong and Sudoku and so forth. You can install Steam through the App Store on here and run some cool games, some more heavier 3D games and so forth. And from what I've heard, Fortnite might even be playable on Linux. I haven't tried that, but I think just this month they've come out with some fixes for the anti-cheat problem. So yeah, that might be something I might have to investigate. Our sound applications, we got Celluloid, which is like an MP3 audio player and media player as well, and then an MPV media player for videos. And then we got Rhythm Box, which I believe is mostly for sound files, music files, MP3s, and so forth. So that's always good. Our Office suite, which we were just in, and LibreOffice Base is equivalent to Microsoft Access. It's the database program. And then we got Calc, which is equivalent to Excel. LibreOffice Draw, which is equivalent to, I forgot what it's called, Microsoft something, sorry, it's escaping me, but yes. And then LibreOffice Impress is equivalent to PowerPoint. Then we have Math, which I don't think there is an equivalent for Office. And then LibreOffice Writer, which is equivalent to Microsoft Word. The LibreOffice Office Suite, totally open source, nice. And then under Internet, we have our Firefox web browser as the default. And then of course you can install Chromium or Chrome if you wish. And then Ramina is like an RDP client, so if you use RDP or remote desktop on your Windows computer, you can also use it and use that same protocol, RDP, in Ramina. And I think Ramina is already set up, it is for RDP. On some distros, if you install Ramina separately, you got to install the RDP component separately. But it's all done for you here in Ubuntu. So that's good. Also under Internet, we got Thunderbird Mail. So that's a mail client somewhat similar to Microsoft Outlook. If you like using mail clients and Outlook was your thing, the Thunderbird Mail is not a bad alternative. And of course there are other mail clients too that you can find in the App Store if you want something different. And Transmission, I believe, is a torrent client. If you like to use torrents, Transmission is a good way to grab some torrents. And personally, when I download Linux ISOs, I prefer the torrents because the downloads are much faster and some ISOs can be pretty big. Always nice to have a torrent client at your disposal. Under graphics, we got GIMP, which is the equivalent to Photoshop. Then we got a document scanner, document viewer, which typically you could use for viewing PDF files. GThumb is a picture viewer. Image Magic is a kind of a editor for image files. And then LibreOffice Draw again, which is kind of equivalent to like the Microsoft something. I forgot what it is, but there's some app in Microsoft that you can do diagrams and things like that with. And then you got Photos. So here, this will go and look for photos that are on your computer and let you even store them online if you like, or grab them from online. And you can organize your photos and categorize them in albums and so forth using Photos. Like I was saying earlier in the beginning of the video, I'll just take a real quick look inside here in the GIMP to kind of give you a quick tour. When you go into GIMP, it kind of looks like this. Now, if you really want something that's laid out like Photoshop, there is a reskinned version of GIMP, which is called PhotoGIMP. And PhotoGIMP will allow you to have a Photoshop-like setup, which is pretty nice. And that's something you can easily find on Google. So if I were to just jump into my web browser here and Google that, PhotoGIMP, my first result would be here at GitHub. And it's also available on Windows, of course. So if you're not ready to convert over to Linux yet, but you're kind of interested in trying out PhotoGIMP, just jump out and give it a try. And so here's PhotoGIMP here. As you can see, it's laid out like the familiar Photoshop. So that's a nice alternative. And here we have a tutorial for using it on Mac OS and on Windows. And PhotoGIMP is available as a flat pack or a DEB file. DEB is really more of an installer. So when you have a DEB file and run it, it'll open up in a software installer and then install onto your Ubuntu Linux or any Debian-based Linux. And it's also available in Snap or an app image. An app image is kind of like a portable image. It's all one file and everything's kind of packed in there, all the libraries and everything, into one neat file instead of in a folder somewhere. So app images are nice, and those are things I like using too here in Linux. So definitely something worth looking into if you want a Photoshop-like. And I do have a video on PhotoGIMP, so you can just do a quick search for PhotoGIMP Jack Keeper, and you will find that tutorial. And it'll kind of go into detail on how to use PhotoGIMP and how to get it and install it and all that good stuff. It's really quite easy to use. One thing that's different about GIMP is once you create a file and save it, you don't simply just save the file, because if you hit save, it's going to actually save a project file. To save it as an image like a PNG file or a JPEG or whatever, you would actually go to File and then select Export or Export As, and then just put in the file name like blah 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 PNG, and it will automatically create a PNG file for you. And same with JPG. It'll detect what you name it. So if you name it a JPG in your file name, it will create a JPEG for you. So that's GIMP. Just a quick tour. So anyways, that is the basics on converting over to Linux from Windows. And like I said, everybody's situation is different. So for some people, transitioning to Linux is easy. For others, not so easy, because you may have a situation where you depend on Windows type software, or you might be a hardcore gamer that's never going to give up that one game that only works on Windows. So yes, those are things you got to know. That's why I always recommend trying out Linux first, either on a separate machine, a different laptop, where you can just get in there and just kind of use it. And if you find yourself using Linux a lot more than Windows, you might be a great candidate to switch over. Or if you're just so ticked off at Microsoft because you're getting forced into another update and maybe your hardware can't handle it, and you just don't have $1,000 to go out there and buy another computer right now, and you know that you're going to be obsoleted out of Windows 10 before long. And if that really ticks you off, then Linux might be a great alternative, because Linux is free. You don't have to pay for it. There's an application called VirtualBox that you can install right from the App Store on here, and install Windows right inside VirtualBox, and you can run your Windows apps in VirtualBox. You can be in a Windows environment inside Linux. And those are things that are touched upon in my other videos as well. So anyways, to get back on the subject, where was I? Yes, so Linux is free. Like I was saying, I can run Windows inside VirtualBox and I don't have to register it. It may not let me change the wallpaper or something like that if it's not registered. At least that's the way it used to be. Like in Windows 7, I could just run Windows and just run my applications, and really I didn't care if I couldn't change the wallpaper. It didn't make any difference to me, because I just want to run an app if I have to run something in Windows, like especially if I'm creating some software and I want to make a Windows version and just test it out to make sure it can run in Windows. Because I can create software in Linux and cross-compile it for Windows and then test it out in a Windows environment. And so for things like that, or if I wanted to run Office for some reason, I could do that. Microsoft Office. There's a trading application called Desk Trader Pro, which only runs in Windows. So I can run that in Windows in a virtual machine and have no issues, even though I'm on a Linux computer, and I don't have to go out and get a Windows computer and put up with all the spyware BS just to run one application. So, yes, those are nice alternatives for situations where you got software that you just can't get around. So anyways, if you want to convert to Linux from Windows, back up your stuff, and if you have nothing that's essential to your existence in Windows, then I recommend just jumping in and doing it. Just dive in. If you have a DIY type attitude, it helps, because you do got to kind of figure out some things for yourself, unless you got a friend or a relative that knows Linux, that understands it, or an IT guy. But if you know enough to be dangerous, or you're not intimidated by tweaking things in Windows, then yes, I say go for it. And again, try the live version first. And with that, I hope this video was helpful in getting you started. If it was, don't forget to leave that thumbs up and hit subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.